At 4:47 in the morning on October 25, 1944, Commander Ernest Edwin Evans stood on the bridge of the USS Johnston and watched the impossible become real. Through his binoculars, in the faint pre-dawn light off the coast of Samar in the Philippines, he could see the silhouettes of Japanese warships emerging from the darkness. Not destroyers, not cruisers, battleship, 4 of them, including the massive Yamato, the largest warship ever built, accompanied by 6 heavy cruisers and 11 destroyers. Evans lowered his binoculars and felt his heart, already weakened by a condition he had hidden from the Navy Medical Board for 6 months, skip a beat. The Japanese center force, which American intelligence had declared crippled and retreating, had instead steamed through San Bernardino Strait during the night and was now bearing down on the most vulnerable part of the American invasion fleet. Between this overwhelming force and the defenseless escort carriers of Taffy 3 stood exactly 7 destroyers and destroyer escorts. The Johnston displaced 2,700 tons and carried 5 5-inch guns. The Yamato displaced 72,000 tons and carried 9 18-inch guns, each capable of firing a shell that weighed more than an automobile. The mathematics were not merely unfavorable, they were apocalyptic. Evans was 36 years old, the son of a Cherokee mother and a white father, the first Native American to command a destroyer in the United States Navy. And in approximately 3 minutes he would have to make a decision that would either save thousands of lives or kill every man under his command. There was no third option. There was no time to wait for orders. There was only the enemy, closing at 25 knots, and the carriers behind him, slow and helpless, carrying the aircraft that were keeping Marines alive on the beaches. Evans turned to his officer of the deck and spoke in a voice that did not shake. Found general quarters. All hands to battle stations. This is not a drill. Ernest Edwin Evans was not supposed to be here. Born on August 13, 1908, in Pawnee, Oklahoma, he grew up in a world that had very specific ideas about where a half-Cherokee boy belonged, and commanding a United States Navy destroyer was not on that list. His father was a blacksmith who drank too much and worked too hard. His mother was a Cherokee woman who taught him that anger was a tool, not a weakness, and that the measure of a man was not what others thought of him but what he was willing to endure for something larger than himself. Evans entered the Naval Academy in 1927, one of the first Native Americans ever admitted, and spent for years being reminded by classmates, instructors, and the institution itself that he was different. He graduated in 1931, ranked in the top third of his class despite facing discrimination that would have broken men with less steel in their spines. His early career was unremarkable in the official records: duty on cruisers, routine assignments, steady promotions. But those who served with him remembered something else. They remembered a junior officer who would stand watch for exhausted sailors, who studied tactics with an obsessive intensity, and who once told a senior officer to his face that following stupid orders was not courage, it was cowardice dressed in uniform. That comment nearly ended his career. Instead, it marked him as someone willing to do what was right even when it cost him, and the Navy, despite its flaws, occasionally recognized that such men were valuable. By October 27, 1943, when Evans took command of the newly commissioned USS Johnston, he had 15 years of experience and a reputation that made some admirals nervous and others quietly hopeful. On the day of the Johnston's commissioning ceremony, Evans did something that naval tradition did not require and regulations did not encourage. He assembled the entire crew on the main deck, 273 men ranging in age from 18 to 45, and spoke to them without notes or prepared remarks. He told them that the Johnston would be a fighting ship, that she would seek out combat, not avoid it, that anyone who could not accept this should request a transfer immediately, with no shame and no consequences. He told them that he would never ask them to do anything he would not do first, and that if the ship went down, he would go down with her, because that was what command meant. He told them, in words that survivors would repeat 70 years later in interviews with historians, that this was going to be a journey into hell, and that they would either come out the other side as brothers or they would die as brothers. But they would not run, they would not surrender, and they would not disgrace themselves or the flag they served. When he finished, the crew stood in silence. Then someone in the back ranks began to clap, slowly at first, then others joined, and within seconds the entire crew was applauding. Not because Evans had said anything particularly eloquent, but because he had looked them in the eyes and told them the truth. No one requested a transfer. In the 11 months between commissioning and the Battle off Samar, Evans drove his crew with a relentlessness that bordered on cruelty. He ran gunnery drills until the 5-inch gun crews could fire 20 rounds per minute, double the Navy standard. He held damage control exercises at 3 in the morning, simulating fires, flooding, casualties, testing whether exhausted men could still function when adrenaline and training were all they had left. He trained the torpedo crews to reload in the dark, with half their equipment disabled, while wearing gas masks. The crew hated him for it, called him a tyrant, complained in letters home. Then they fought at Kwajalein and in Utah, took hits from shore batteries, lost men, and realized that Evans's drills were the only reason more of them had not died. After that, they stopped complaining. They still thought he was insane, but they trusted him absolutely. What the crew did not know, because Evans never told anyone except the ship's doctor, who he swore to secrecy, was that he had been diagnosed with a cardiac arrhythmia in April of 1944. The condition was degenerative, exacerbated by stress, and according to Navy medical regulations, should have resulted in his immediate removal from combat duty. Evans refused the recommended transfer. He told the doctor that the Johnston and her crew needed him more than he needed to live to be an old man, and that if the doctor reported the condition, Evans would claim the diagnosis was fraudulent. The doctor, faced with a choice between ending the career of the best destroyer captain he had ever met and violating regulation, chose to falsify the medical record. It was an act of loyalty that both men knew could result in courts-martial, and neither of them cared. Evans returned to duty, swallowed pills that barely controlled his symptoms, and continued to drive himself and his crew toward a standard of excellence that assumed death was always one mistake away. On the morning of October 25, 1944, when the Japanese fleet appeared on the horizon, Ernest Evans had been awake for 23 hours. His heart was beating irregularly, and he was in constant low-grade pain. None of this showed on his face. None of this affected his decisions, because whatever else Ernest Evans was, a Cherokee kid from Oklahoma who had clawed his way to command against every obstacle the world could place in his path. He was not a man who quit when things became difficult. The men who served on the USS Johnston came from everywhere and nowhere, a cross-section of Depression-era America thrown together by the machinery of war. Lieutenant Robert Hagen, the executive officer, was 32 years old, from a small town in Minnesota where his family had farmed wheat for 3 generations. He had attended the University of Minnesota on a scholarship, graduated with a degree in engineering, and joined the Navy in 1940 because teaching high school mathematics seemed like a slow death and he wanted to see the world. He was methodical, cautious, the opposite of Evans in temperament, and that was exactly why they worked so well together. When Evans proposed aggressive tactics that bordered on suicidal, Hagen calculated the odds and figured out how to reduce them from certain death to merely probable death. The crew called him the professor behind his back, with affection and respect, because he explained things instead of just giving orders, and because he had once spent for hours tutoring a young seaman in navigation so the kid could pass his promotion exam. Hagen had a wife and 2 daughters in Minnesota. He carried their photograph in his breast pocket and wrote them letters every Sunday, carefully worded so as not to frighten them, full of descriptions of sunsets and dolphins and the mundane details of shipboard life, never mentioning that he was terrified every single day and that he remained on the Johnston primarily because he believed Evans would get himself killed without someone to provide ballast. Chief Petty Officer Andrew Jackson, no relation to the president despite the jokes that followed him everywhere, was 33 years old and had been in the Navy for 14 years. He was from Mobile, Alabama, a black man in a segregated military that allowed him to serve but restricted where and how. Jackson was one of the few African Americans to achieve Chief Petty Officer rank in the engineering department, a fact that spoke to both his exceptional competence and the Navy's reluctant acknowledgement that talent sometimes appeared in people the institution preferred to it. He was responsible for the Johnston's propulsion system, the steam turbines and boilers that generated 60,000 shaft horsepower and pushed the destroyer to speeds that made her hull plates vibrate. Jackson knew every valve, every pipe, every gauge in the engine. He could diagnose problems by sound, could feel when machinery was running outside normal parameters, and could improvise repairs under conditions that would paralyze men who relied only on training manual. He was also, though few people knew this, deeply religious, a deacon in the Baptist church he attended whenever the Johnston was in port, and he prayed every morning not for his own safety but for the wisdom to do his job well enough that other men would survive. Jackson had survived to ship sinkings already in his Navy career, once when a submarine torpedoed his cruiser near Guadalcanal, and once when a destroyer he served on struck a mine off New Guinea. He believed, with the fatalism of someone who had seen too much, that he was destined to die at sea, and this belief made him calmer than most men in combat because he had already accepted the outcome and was focused only on doing his duty before it arrived. Ensign Robert Billy was 20 years old, from a farm in Kansas, and had been on the Johnston for exactly 7 months. He was tall, thin, earnest, with a face that still looked more boy than man despite the uniform and the rank insignia. He had joined the Navy in 1943 after his older brother was killed at Tarawa, driven by a combination of grief and rage and the inchoate sense that sitting out the war would be a betrayal. Billy served as a lookout and assistant navigation officer, positions that required good eyesight and attention to detail but not much combat experience, which was fortunate because he had almost none. What he did have was a gift for language. He spoke German fluently because his grandmother had been born in Bavaria, and he had taught himself basic Japanese from a phrase book he found in a library in Honolulu, motivated by the vague idea that knowing the enemy's language might someday be used. On the Johnston, this skill had proven valuable exactly once, when the ship picked up survivors from a downed Japanese reconnaissance plane and Billy was able to interrogate them before they were transferred to intelligence officer. Evans had commended him for that, and Billy had carried the memory of that commendation like a talisman, proof that he was not completely useless. What Billy did not tell anyone was that he was terrified every moment of every day, that he had nightmares about drowning, and that he volunteered for extra watches primarily to avoid sleep. His crewmates thought he was brave. In reality, he was just too scared to rest. Seaman First Class Joseph Martinez was 19 years old, from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and served as a loader on the No. 4 5-inch gun mount. He was short, muscular, with arms developed from 2 years working in his father's auto repair shop before the war. Martinez was fast, which mattered in combat because loading a 5-inch shell weighing 55 pounds into a gun breech over and over again required speed as much as strength. He could load 15 rounds per minute, sustain that pace for 10 minutes, and still have enough energy left to help with damage control if the ship was hit. Martinez was also a gambler, running poker games in the crew quarters, taking baits on everything from boxing matches to how long Liberty would last in port. He won more often than he lost, not because he was lucky but because he counted cards and read people, skills he had learned from an uncle who made a living at casinos in Las Vegas. The money Martinez won, he sent home to his mother, who was raising 6 younger children after his father died of tuberculosis in 1942. Martinez planned to survive the war, go back to Albuquerque, open his own garage, and never think about the Navy again. He had not told anyone on the Johnston, but he had been offered a transfer to a cruiser 2 months earlier, a safer assignment with better promotion prospects, and he had turned it down because leaving felt like abandoning the gun crew that depended on him. It was a decision he would spend the rest of his life examining. These men, and 268 others like them, were the crew of the USS Johnston, and they were utterly ordinary. They were farm boys and city kids, high school graduates and college dropouts, volunteers and draftees, men who had joined the Navy to see the world, or escape poverty or prove something to themselves. Most of them had never been in serious combat before Leyte Gulf. Most of them were scared most of the time. And on the morning of October 25, 1944, when Commander Evans gave the order to attack a Japanese fleet 10 times their size, every single one of them went to his battle station and did his job, not because they were heroes, but because they were crew, and leaving your crew to die while you ran was not something any of them could live with. That, more than any medal or commendation, is what made them extraordinary. The Japanese plan that brought their center force to Samar was brilliant, audacious, and nearly worked. After the catastrophic losses at Midway, the Philippine Sea, and a dozen smaller battles, the Imperial Japanese Navy was a shadow of what it had been in 1940. But it was not dead, and the Japanese High Command understood that the American invasion of the Philippines represented an existential threat. If the Philippines fell, Japan would be cut off from its oil supplies in the Dutch East Indies, its southern territories would be isolated, and the home islands would face starvation and industrial collapse. The invasion had to be stopped, even if stopping it required sacrificing every remaining warship Japan possessed. The plan, codenamed Shogo, divided the remaining Japanese fleet into 3 forces. The northern force, built around Japan's last operational carriers, would sail toward Luzon and act as bait, luring the American fast carriers away from Leyte Gulf. The southern force would approach through Surigao Strait from the south, and the center force, the most powerful of the three, would transit San Bernardino Strait and attack the invasion fleet from the north. The plan required precise timing, strict radio silence, and a willingness to sacrifice the carrier force, which had almost no aircraft left and existed primarily to be sunk. It also required the Americans to make a critical mistake. They did. On October 24, 1944, American submarines and aircraft detected the Japanese center force as it approached the Philippines from the west. The force was massive, 4 battleships including the Yamato and Musashi, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, under the command of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. American carrier aircraft attacked the force repeatedly throughout the day, damaging several ships and sinking the Musashi, but failing to stop the advance. That evening, Admiral William Halsey, commanding the American Third Fleet, received reports that a Japanese carrier force had been spotted. Halsey faced a choice: remain near Leyte Gulf to guard the invasion fleet, or take his fast battleships and carriers north to destroy the Japanese carriers. He chose to go north. It was the decision that every instinct and doctrine told him to make. Carriers were the primary striking arm of naval warfare. Destroying the Japanese carrier force would eliminate a major threat. Remaining on defensive guard duty was not how you won wars, so Halsey sailed north with every battleship, every fleet carrier, and every heavy cruiser under his command, leaving Leyte Gulf protected only by the 7th Fleet's escort carriers and their screens. He sent a message to Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, commanding the 7th Fleet, informing him of this decision. Through a combination of communication failures and assumption, Kinkaid believed that Halsey had left a detachment of battleships to guard San Bernardino Strait. Halsey had not. The strait was undefended. At 2:30 in the morning on October 25th, Vice Admiral Kurita led the Japanese center force through San Bernardino Strait in complete darkness and without opposition. The American submarines and aircraft that should have been patrolling the area had been pulled away to support other operations. No one was watching. By 4 in the morning, Kurita's fleet was steaming south along the coast of Samar, moving at 20 knots, maintaining radio silence, preparing to fall upon the invasion fleet at dawn. The Japanese sailors, exhausted from days of air attacks, understood that this was likely a one-way mission. But they also understood that if they could sink enough American transports and cargo ships, they could strand American soldiers on the beaches without supplies, ammunition, or reinforcements, turning the invasion into a disaster that might buy Japan months or even years of continued resistance. It was worth dying for. Kurita's plan was simple: approach from the north, divide his force to envelop the Americans, and destroy everything in sight. He expected to face destroyers and possibly some cruisers. He did not expect significant resistance. At 6:45 in the morning, as the sky began to lighten, a lookout on the Yamato spotted masts on the southern horizon. Kurita assumed they were the outer screen of the invasion fleet. He was partially right. They were escort carriers of Task Unit 77.4.3, call sign Taffy 3, the northernmost of 3 escort carrier groups assigned to provide air support for the ground troops. Taffy 3 consisted of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escort. The carriers were the Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitkin Bay, and Gambier Bay. They were small, slow, barely armed, designed to carry aircraft for ground support mission, not fleet combat. The destroyers were the Johnston, Hull, and Harriman, each displacing around 2,700 tons. The destroyer escorts were even smaller: Samuel B. Roberts, Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond, displacing around 1,400 tons. Together, these 13 ships faced a Japanese force that outweighed them by a factor of more than 10 to 1 and outgunned them by an even larger margin. The escort carriers could make 17 knots at maximum speed. Kurita's battleships could make 27. The carriers' only weapons were single 5-inch guns mounted for anti-aircraft defense. The Yamato alone could fire 9 shells per salvo, each shell capable of destroying a carrier with a single hit. The mathematics were so lopsided that when Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3 from the Fanshawe Bay, first received reports of Japanese battleships, he assumed it was an identification. Then he looked through his binoculars and saw pagoda masts, the distinctive superstructures of Japanese battleships, emerging from the dawn haze. He realized, with a clarity that must have felt like ice water in his veins, that his entire task unit was about to be annihilated unless someone did something impossible. He grabbed the radio and broadcast an emergency message in the clear: no longer concerned about maintaining radio silence because secrecy was irrelevant. Were about to die. Enemy surface force attacking, require immediate assistance. And then, because there was nothing else to do, he ordered his carriers to run south at maximum speed, launch every aircraft they had, and pray. On the Johnston, Commander Evans heard that broadcast, looked at the Japanese fleet closing from the north, and made his decision. At 6:58 in the morning, Commander Evans turned to his officer of the deck and spoke words that would be recorded in the Johnston's action report and remembered by survivors for the rest of their lives. Commence attack. All engines ahead flank. Prepare torpedoes for surface action. Target the lead cruiser. We are going in. Lieutenant Hagen, standing beside him on the bridge, opened his mouth to say something, hesitated, then closed it again. There was nothing to say. Evans was right. Someone had to attack the Japanese fleet, and if the destroyers did not do it, the carriers would be slaughtered in the next 20 minutes. The only question was whether attacking would make any difference, or simply mean that the destroyers died 10 minutes before the carriers instead of 10 minutes after. Hagen turned to the helm and repeated the order. Helm, all ahead flank, come to course to 90. Stand by for torpedo launch. The Johnston surged forward as Chief Jackson, down in the engine room, opened the throttles to maximum and watched the steam pressure climb into the red zone. The twin screws bit into the water, the destroyer's bow lifted slightly, and within 90 seconds the ship was making 35 knots, her hull vibrating from the strain, black smoke pouring from her stacks as the boilers burned fuel at a rate that would empty the tanks in 3 hours. On the main deck, sailors who had been standing at relaxed battle stations suddenly understood that this was not a drill or a false alarm. They were charging toward for battleships. Some of them began to pray. Others checked their equipment one more time, making small adjustments that meant nothing but gave their hands something to do. In the number 4 gun mount, Seaman Martinez crossed himself and whispered something in Spanish that his loader did not understand but recognized as a prayer. The Johnston was not alone. Commander William Thomas, captain of the destroyer hull, saw Evans's charge and made the same decision. 30 seconds later, the hull was accelerating to attack speed, angling toward the Japanese formation from a slightly different vector. Commander Amos Hathaway, commanding the Heermann, followed within a minute. And then, incredibly, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, commanding the tiny destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, pushed his ship to flank speed despite the fact that the Roberts displaced barely half what a fleet destroyer did and carried only to 5-inch. 4 ships, displacing a combined total of less than 9,000 tons, were charging toward a fleet that displaced more than 200,000 tons. No one had ordered them to attack. Admiral Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, was still trying to organize a defense when the destroyers began their runs. The decision to attack was made independently by 4 captains who looked at the situation and reached the same conclusion. Running was pointless because the Japanese were faster. Staying back to provide close escort was pointless because the carriers were doomed unless the enemy was disrupted. And attacking, even though it meant probable death, at least offered a chance to buy time, cause confusion, and maybe, just maybe, convince the Japanese that they were facing a more significant force than they actually were. It was not a heroic decision in the Hollywood sense. It was a cold calculation that attacking gave a slightly better chance of survival than any alternative, combined with a visceral refusal to watch carriers burn without trying to do something about it. At 7:04 in the morning, the Johnston opened fire with her main battery. The 5 5-inch guns began a rolling barrage, firing as fast as could load, shells arcing across 6,000 yards of ocean and slamming into the superstructure of the Japanese heavy cruiser. The Kumano displaced 13,000 tons, carried 10 8-inch guns, and was armored to withstand battleship caliber shells. The Johnston's 5-inch shells could not penetrate that armor, but they could destroy external equipment. The first shells hit the Kumano's forward fire control director, shattering the rangefinders and killing the crew inside. The next salvo destroyed the radio antennas, cutting the cruiser's communication with the rest of the fleet. More shells walked up the superstructure, starting fires, wrecking the radar system, turning the bridge into chaos. The Kumano began to turn, trying to bring her main battery to bear on the Johnston, but Evans was already maneuvering, zigzagging at high speed, making himself a difficult target while maintaining a steady rate of fire. On the bridge, Ensign Billy, serving as a lookout, watched through binoculars as their shells hit home and felt a surge of exhilaration that immediately turned to terror as the Kumano's 8-inch guns fired back. The first salvo from the Kumano was a ranging shot, falling 200 yards short, throwing up geysers of water that soaked the Johnston's forward deck. The second salvo was over, passing 50 yards above the bridge with a sound like a freight train. The third salvo straddled the ship, shells hitting on both sides, close enough that the concussion shattered windows and knocked men off their feet. At 7:09 in the morning, Commander Evans made his critical decision. He had closed to within 10,000 yards of the Japanese formation, threading through a gap between the Kumano and a trailing destroyer, and he was now inside effective torpedo range. But launching torpedoes would commit the Johnston to a straight course for at least 30 seconds, making her an easy target for every enemy ship that could see her. If Evans waited for a better angle, the Japanese would reorganize and the opportunity would be lost. If he launched now, from a less than optimal position, some of the torpedoes might miss, but at least they would be in the water. Evans grabbed the intercom to the torpedo room. "Prepare to fire all torpedoes on my command. Set depth 10 feet, spread pattern. Target the lead cruiser and anything behind her. Fire on my mark." He watched the range. 9,800 yards, 9,500, 9,000. The Johnston was now so close to the Japanese formation that he could see individual sailors on the enemy decks, see the details of their superstructures, see gun barrels tracking toward his ship. The Kumano fired again, and this time a shell hit, striking the Johnston's forward deck near the number 2 gun mount, punching through the thin plating and detonating inside. The explosion killed 3 men instantly and wounded 5 more. Fire broke out in the crew compartments. Smoke poured from the vents, and Commander Evans, his face expressionless, watched the range indicator tick down to 8,500 yards and spoke the order. "Fire torpedoes, all tubes." The Johnston shuddered as all 10 torpedo tubes released their weapon. The Mark 15 torpedoes, each weighing 3,000 pounds and carrying 800 pounds of Torpex explosive, hit the water and began their run toward the Japanese formation. They were set to travel at 46 knots, running at a depth of 10 feet, with a spread pattern designed to cover a wide area and maximize the chance of hitting some. Evans had aimed the spread at the Kumano and the ships behind her, gambling that even if the cruiser evaded, something else might blunder into the torpedo tracks. For 70 agonizing seconds, the torpedoes ran through the water, leaving wakes of white foam that were clearly visible in the morning light. The Japanese ships began evasive maneuvers, turning hard, their formations breaking apart as individual captains tried to avoid the incoming weapons. And then, at 7:11 in the morning, at least 2 torpedoes struck the Kumano. The explosions were massive, visible as flashes of orange light even from 8,000 yards away. The Kumano's bow lifted out of the water, then crashed back down, her forward section engulfed in flames. She immediately lost speed, falling from 25 knots to 16, her forward engine room flooding, her steering damaged. Within 2 minutes, she had fallen out of formation entirely, trailing oil and listing 5 degrees to port, no longer a threat to anyone. Commander Evans allowed himself exactly 3 seconds of satisfaction. Then the Yamato opened fire, and satisfaction became irrelevant. The first indication that the Yamato had targeted the Johnston was not visual but auditory. The sound of 18-inch guns firing from 12,000 yards away is not something human beings are neurologically equipped to process. It is not a bang or a roar. It is a physical force that travels through the air as a compression wave, hitting the body before the brain can register what is happening. Men on the Johnston's deck felt their lungs compress, felt their ears pop, felt a pressure that made their teeth ache, and only then did they hear the sound. A bass roar so deep it was felt in bones rather than heard with ears. Commander Evans, standing on the bridge, had approximately 6 seconds between the muzzle flash and the impact to make a decision. He could turn into the shells, trying to present a narrow profile, which might reduce the chance of being hit, but would also slow the Johnston and make her a stationary target for the next salvo. He could continue on course and hope the Japanese rangefinders had miscalculated. Or he could turn away, presenting the ship's full beam, and try to open the range. Evans chose to turn away, gambling that speed and distance were better than evasion. He was wrong. The first salvo from the Yamato consisted of 3 shells, each weighing 3,200 pounds, each carrying 660 pounds of high explosive, each fired from a gun barrel 75 feet long at a muzzle velocity that bent the laws of physics. The shells traveled through the air in a flat arc, their trajectory so fast that they were barely visible, dark blurs against the morning sky. The first shell hit the water 50 yards off the Johnston's port quarter, detonating on impact and throwing up a column of water 100 feet high. The second shell hit the water 30 yards off the starboard beam. The third shell hit the Johnston. The shell struck the aft section of the ship, near the number 5 5-inch gun mount, punching through the deck armor as if it were paper. it did not detonate immediately. Armor-piercing shells are designed with delayed fuses, allowing them to penetrate deep into a ship's structure before exploding. This shell traveled through to decks, passed through the crew berthing compartment, and detonated in the aft engine. The explosion was cataclysmic. The engine room, a space measuring roughly 30 feet by 40 feet, was instantly filled with expanding gases at a temperature of over 3,000 degrees. The two machinist mates on duty, Petty Officer Second Class William Chen and Seaman Thomas Albright, were killed so quickly that their bodies were vaporized. The blast ruptured steam lines, shattered gauges, and tore machinery from its mountings. Superheated steam, escaping from broken pipes at 350 degrees and 600 pounds per square inch of pressure, filled adjacent compartments. 3 more men died from steam inhalation in the next 15 seconds. The Johnston's speed dropped from 35 knots to 12 in less than 10 seconds as the port engine went offline and the starboard engine lost steam pressure. On the bridge, Commander Evans felt the deck lurch beneath him. The intercom from the engine room was dead, replaced by a high-pitched squeal that meant the communication circuit had been destroyed. Evans grabbed the sound-powered phone, a backup system that required no electrical power, and called down to the forward engine. Chief Jackson's voice came back, strained but functional. "Captain, we have lost the aft engine. Total loss. No survivors. We are trying to reroute steam to the forward turbines, but we have multiple ruptures. I can give you maybe 15 knots, 17 if we bypass every safety system and accept that the boilers might explode." "Do it," Evans said. "Give me everything you have. If the boilers explode, we are dead anyway. Bypass everything. I need speed." Down in the forward engine room, Chief Jackson and his team began the most dangerous improvisation of their careers. The engine room was a maze of pipes, valves, turbines, and boilers, all connected by systems designed with multiple redundancies and safety cutoffs to prevent catastrophic failures. Jackson was now systematically disabling those safety, rerouting steam through pipes that were never meant to carry that much pressure, closing valves that were supposed to remain open, and opening valves that were supposed to remain closed. The temperature in the engine room climbed from 90 degrees to 120. Men stripped to their waists, their skin red from heat, their lungs burning from superheated air. One sailor, Fireman First Class Douglas Perry, collapsed from heat exhaustion and had to be dragged to a cooler compartment. But slowly, impossibly, the steam pressure began to climb. The starboard turbine, now receiving steam from both boilers through improvised routing, began to accelerate. The propeller shaft revolutions increased, and the Johnston, trailing smoke and listing 3 degrees to port, began to pick up speed. 12 knots, 14, 16, 17. At 7:14 in the morning, 90 seconds after being hit by an 18-inch shell, the Johnston was making 17 knots and turning south, trying to open the range from the Japanese fleet while her remaining guns continued to fire. It should have been impossible. Every engineering manual said it was impossible. Chief Jackson made it happen anyway, because the alternative was watching his ship die while he followed regulations. But the Johnston was no longer the only target. The destroyer's hull and Heermann had closed to within torpedo range and were launching their own attacks. The hull fired all 14 of her torpedoes at the battleship Congo, forcing the massive ship to turn away and lose position in the formation. The Heermann engaged 2 Japanese cruisers, her 5-inch guns firing at maximum rate, and succeeded in damaging the cruiser Chikuma's bridge, killing several officers. The little destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts charged into the formation despite being armed with only 2 5-inch guns and 3 torpedoes, her captain apparently having decided that if he was going to die, he might as well die making it. The effect of these attacks was far greater than their actual damage. Vice Admiral Kurita, commanding the Japanese center force from the bridge of the Yamato, was faced with a tactical situation that made no sense. He had expected to encounter a few destroyers, providing a light screen for cargo ships and transports. Instead, he was being attacked by destroyers that were charging directly at his battleships, launching torpedoes with suicidal aggression, and fighting with a ferocity that suggested they were the vanguard of a much larger force. Kurita had been awake for 36 hours. He had been under continuous air attack for 2 days. His flagship had taken minor damage from bombs, and now, in the confusion of combat, with smoke screens obscuring visibility and reports coming in from multiple ships about torpedoes in the water and destroyers emerging from unexpected directions, he began to believe that he had not encountered escort carriers but fleet carriers, not destroyers but cruisers, and that the American trap had caught him instead of the other way around. It was a fatal miscalculation. At 7:23 in the morning, Kurita ordered his fleet to turn northwest, away from the escort carriers, to regroup and assess the situation. The order saved Taffy 3. It also gave the Johnston a brief, desperate chance to survive. Between 7:23 and 7:41 in the morning, the USS Johnston fought the strangest battle of her career, a running-gun duel against multiple Japanese destroyers while maneuvering to avoid Japanese cruisers and battleships, all while her engineering crew performed miracles to keep a crippled ship moving. Commander Evans had taken advantage of Kurita's temporary withdrawal to turn south, chasing after the fleeing escort carriers and trying to put himself between them and any Japanese ships that might resume the attack. It was a tactically sound decision and also completely insane, because the Johnston was now damaged, slow, and operating on one engine that could fail at any moment. But it kept his ship in the fight, and for Evans, that was the only thing that mattered. At 7:29, a Japanese destroyer, later identified as the Naoki, closed to within 5,000 yards and fire. The Johnston returned fire with her forward guns. For 8 minutes, the two ships exchanged salvos, neither able to land a decisive hit, both maneuvering at high speed in a dance that would have been beautiful if it had not been lethal. Then the Johnston's gun mount suffered a mechanical failure, a broken firing circuit that took the gun offline. Evans now had 4 working 5-inch guns instead of 5. The odds, already terrible, got worse. At 7:36, 3 more Japanese destroyers joined the attack. The Johnston was now surrounded, taking fire from 4 directions, and running out of options. On the bridge, Lieutenant Hagen was coordinating the fire control, directing the remaining guns to engage the closest threats, while Ensign Billy plotted the positions of enemy ships and tried to find a gap in the encirclement. There was no gap. Commander Evans made a decision that would define the rest of the battle. Instead of trying to evade, he would charge directly at the nearest enemy destroyer, close the range to point-blank distance, and hope that aggression would create an opening. It worked, but not in the way he expected. The Johnston turned hard to port and accelerated toward the Naoki, closing the range from 5,000 yards to 3,000 in less than 2 minutes, her forward guns firing continuously. The Naoki's captain, faced with a damaged American destroyer charging at him with apparent disregard for survival, assumed the Johnston was attempting a ramming attack and turned away to avoid collision. The maneuver opened a gap in the encirclement. The Johnston shot through it, escaping the immediate trap, but taking 3 more hits in the process. One shell struck the forward superstructure, destroying the fire control radar and killing 2 men. Another hit the base of the forward smokestack, tearing it loose and sending it crashing onto the deck, crushing a lifeboat and narrowly missing the number 3 gun mount. A third shell hit the bridge. The shell was a 6-inch high explosive round, fired from one of the pursuing destroyers at a range of 4,000 yards. It entered the bridge through the starboard window, passed through the chart table, and detonated against the port bulkhead. The explosion was relatively small, but in the confined space of the bridge, it was devastating. Shrapnel tore through equipment, shattered glass, and killed or wounded everyone in the compartment. Ensign Billy was killed instantly, a piece of shrapnel severing his carotid artery. Lieutenant Hagen was thrown against a bulkhead and suffered a broken collarbone and severe laceration. The helmsman, Quartermaster 3rd Class Raymond Lee, lost his left hand but somehow remained at the wheel, steering the ship with his right hand while blood poured from the stump of his left wrist. Commander Evans, standing near the chart table when the shell detonated, was hit by multiple fragments. One piece of shrapnel severed the index and middle fingers of his left hand. Another fragment embedded itself in his left shoulder. A third cut a deep gash across his forehead, filling his eyes with blood. Evans staggered, caught himself on the remains of the chart table, and for a moment could not see anything except red. He wiped the blood from his eyes with his right hand, looked around the bridge, saw Billy's body, saw Hagen struggling to saw Lee still at the helm with one hand, and made a decision that saved one's lives. He did not call for medical assistance. He did not pause to assess his injuries. He grabbed the helm with his remaining functional hand, standing beside Lee, and continued to steer the ship while shouting orders through the intercom with a voice that did not shake. Medical Corpsman 2nd Class David Torres reached the bridge 90 seconds later and found a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Commander Evans was steering the ship with one hand while blood poured from his head and shoulder, soaking his uniform. Quartermaster Lee was standing beside him, still gripping the wheel with his remaining hand, his face white from blood loss. Lieutenant Hagen was on his knees, trying to tie a tourniquet around Lee's arm with one functional arm and clearly failing. Ensign Billy's body lay in the corner, already beyond help. Torres had trained for this, had practiced triage under simulated combat conditions, but no simulation prepared you for the reality of a bridge that looked like an abattoir. He went to Commander Evans first, because Evans was the captain, and if Evans died, the ship would lose cohesion. Evans shoved him away. "Take care of Lee and Hagen first," Evans said. "I am still functional." Torres hesitated, then obeyed, because arguing with the captain, who was clearly in shock and might collapse at any moment, was pointless. He applied a proper tourniquet to Lee's arm, stopping the bleeding, then injected him with morphine. Then he moved to Hagen, bandaged his shoulder, and improvised a sling. Only after that did he turn back to Evans. The captain was still standing, still steering, still giving orders, but his face was gray and his breathing was labored. Torres quickly bandaged the head wound, tied off the severed fingers, and applied a pressure dressing to the shoulder wound. "Evans, you need to go below to the aid station," Torres said. "You have lost a lot of blood." "Not until this fight is over," Evans replied. "Now get off my bridge and help someone who needs it more than I do." Torres left, because there were wounded men all over the ship, and a captain who refused medical treatment was a problem he could not solve. At 7:54 in the morning, the situation changed again. The Japanese center force, after regrouping and reassessing, had realized that the American fleet carriers they were supposedly engaging were actually escort carriers, small and lightly defended. Vice Admiral Kurita ordered his ships to resume the attack, and the Japanese formation turned south again, accelerating toward Taffy 3. The escort carriers, having fled south at their maximum speed of 17 knots for the past hour, had bought time for their aircraft to rearm and launch, but they were still slower than the Japanese battleships and cruisers. Within 20 minutes, the battleships would be within range to begin systematically destroying the carriers one by one. Admiral Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, broadcast another emergency call for assistance. He also ordered his remaining destroyers and destroyer escorts to make one final torpedo attack, a last-ditch effort to disrupt the Japanese advance long enough for airstrikes to arrive. The Johnston, despite being damaged, low on ammunition, and operating on one engine, was still afloat and still had a crew willing to fight. Commander Evans heard Admiral Sprague's order and did not hesitate. He turned the Johnston north, directly toward the approaching Japanese fleet, and called down to the torpedo room. The voice that came back was not what he expected. "Captain, this is Gunner's Mate 2nd Class Patterson. Lieutenant Kowalski is dead, sir. Took a shell fragment in the last attack. I am senior man in the torpedo room now. We have no torpedoes left, sir. We expended all 10 during the first attack." "Understood," Evans said. "Then we will attack with guns. All remaining gun mounts, prepare to engage surface targets. We are going back in." The Johnston was not alone. The destroyer Hull, which had been fighting alongside her for the past hour, turned north as well, despite being even more heavily damaged than the Johnston. The Hull had taken over 40 hits, her forward section was on fire, and she was listing so badly that water was pouring into her lower compartments. Her captain, Commander William Thomas, knew his ship was doomed. He attacked anyway, because that was the mission and because stopping was not an option his conscience could accept. The little destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts also turned north, her 5-inch guns still firing, her crew fighting with a desperation born from the knowledge that their ship had no armor, no speed, and almost no chance of survival. 3 ships, all of them damaged, all of them running low on ammunition, all of them commanded by officers who understood they were probably going to die in the next 10 minutes, charged toward a Japanese fleet that now included 4 battleships, 3 heavy cruisers, and 8 destroyers. It was not a battle, it was a statement that some things are worth dying for, and that courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. At 8:07 in the morning, the Johnston opened fire on a Japanese heavy cruiser at a range of 12,000 yards, at the extreme limit of her gun's effective range. The shells arced high, falling toward the cruiser in a ballistic trajectory, and several of them hit. The damage they inflicted was minor, scratches on armored plating, but the effect was psychological. The Japanese cruiser turned away, not because she was seriously threatened, but because being hit by shells from a supposedly dying destroyer suggested that the destroyer was not as dead as she appeared, and that pressing the attack might be costly. The Hull was not as fortunate. At 8:10 in the morning, she was hit by salvos from multiple Japanese ships simultaneously. Shells from battleships, cruisers, and destroyers converged on her position, and within 60 seconds, the Hull had been hit more than 20 times. Her forward magazine exploded, her engine rooms flooded, her bridge was destroyed, killing Commander Thomas and most of his officers. The ship rolled to port, her hull torn open in multiple places, and began to sink. The crew abandoned ship, jumping into the water as the hull settled beneath the waves. She went down at 8:30, taking with her 253 men, more than half her crew. The survivors would float in the water for 2 days before being rescued, surrounded by sharks, many of them wounded, watching their shipmates die from exposure and blood loss. It was a nightmare that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The Johnston survived 8 more minutes. At 8:18 in the morning, she was engaged by 3 Japanese destroyers at close range. The Japanese ships fired simultaneously, and the Johnston, now almost stationary because her single working engine had finally failed, could not evade. Shells walked up her starboard side, hitting the forward gun mounts, the bridge, the remaining superstructure, the waterline. Within 2 minutes, the Johnston had been hit by at least 15 shells. The forward section was on fire. The aft section was flooding. The ship was listing 12 degrees to port and settling rapidly. Commander Evans, still on the bridge, bleeding from multiple wounds, his left arm useless, looked around at what remained of his crew and spoke the hardest words he had ever said. "Abandon ship," Commander Evans said quietly into the sound-powered phone, his voice barely audible over the roar of fires and the screaming of wounded men. "Pass the word to all station, abandon ship. Get the wounded off first. Destroy all classified material. This is not a request. This is an order." For a moment, no one moved. The men on the bridge, the gun crews still at their station, the damage control parties fighting fires in compartments that were already lost. All of them hesitated because abandoning ship meant admitting defeat. And admitting defeat meant acknowledging that the Johnston was dying and there was nothing more they could do to save her. Then Lieutenant Hagen, his shoulder roughly bandaged, his face pale from blood loss, began moving. He grabbed the bag containing code books and weighted it with pieces of shrapnel, carried it to the side of the bridge, and threw it overboard. He turned to the remaining bridge crew and spoke in a voice that cut through their paralysis. "You heard the captain. Get the wounded topside. Get the life rafts deployed. Move, now." The crew began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency as the reality of the situation penetrated the shock and exhaustion. Men who had been fighting for 90 minutes straight, who were wounded, burned, deafened by explosions, suddenly had a new mission: survival. On the main deck, sailors were pulling wounded men from below, dragging them up ladders, carrying them when they could not walk. Medical Corpsman Torres was everywhere, triaging casualties, deciding who could be moved and who was too badly injured to survive the transfer to a life raft. It was the cruelest calculus of combat medicine. Some men had to be left behind because moving them would kill them and delay the evacuation of men who might survive. Torres made those decisions in seconds, marking men with a grease pencil, a single stroke on the forehead to indicate they were too far gone. The men who were marked understood what it meant. Some of them accepted it with quiet resignation, others begged not to be left behind. Torres moved on because stopping to argue meant more men would die, and he had already seen too many men die today. Chief Petty Officer Jackson emerged from the forward engine room with his team, their skin burned, their uniforms soaked with sweat and oil, their eyes hollow from exhaustion. The engine room was flooding, the machinery wrecked beyond any possibility of repair, and staying below meant drowning in the dark. Jackson had kept the engines running for 90 minutes after being told it was impossible. He had given Commander Evans the speed that kept the Johnston in the fight long enough to matter. Now, climbing onto the deck and seeing the ship listing heavily, fires burning out of control, Japanese destroyers circling like sharks, he allowed himself one moment of grief for the ship he had served and the men he had lost. Then he began helping other sailors deploy the life rafts. Seaman Martinez, bleeding from a shrapnel wound in his leg but still functional, was at the number 4 gun mount helping his crew abandon their station. They had fired over 200 rounds during the battle, loading and firing until their arms burned and their ears bled from the concussion. The gun was now silent, its barrel slightly warped from overheating, its breech jammed with a shell that had failed to seat properly. Martinez looked at the gun, this piece of machinery that he had cleaned and maintained and cursed for 11 months, and felt an absurd impulse to apologize for leaving it behind. Then he turned to his crew and told them to get to the life rafts. The loader, a kid from Tennessee named Bobby Warren, who was 19 years old and terrified, hesitated. "Martinez, are we going to make it?" Warren asked. Martinez wanted to lie, wanted to tell him that everything would be fine, that rescue was coming, that they would all survive. Instead, he told the truth. "I do not know, Bobby. But staying here means we definitely do not make it. So move. They moved, climbing down to the main deck, joining the stream of sailors heading for the side of the ship where life rafts and floater nets were being deployed. The Johnston was settling rapidly now, her bow rising as the stern filled with water, her list increasing to 15 degrees. Men were sliding across the deck, grabbing railings, helping each other toward the relative safety of the rafts. Some of them were praying, some were silent, all of them were moving, because staying meant going down with the ship. Commander Evans was the last man on the bridge. He had sent everyone else down, including Quartermaster Lee, who had protested and had to be physically ordered off the bridge by Lieutenant Hagen. Evans stood alone in the wreckage, looking at the ship he had commanded for 11 months, the ship he had promised would be a fighting ship, the ship that had done exactly what he had asked of her and was now dying because of it. He thought about the men he had lost, 19 dead in the initial hits, more lost during the running battle, men whose names he knew, whose families he had met, whose deaths he would carry for the rest of his life, however long that might be. He thought about the mission, whether they had accomplished anything, whether the sacrifice had mattered. The escort carriers were still afloat. The Japanese had been delayed. Aircraft from other task units were arriving, bombing and strafing the enemy fleet, forcing them to withdraw. The invasion would continue. The Marines on the beaches would receive their supplies. In that sense, the Johnston had succeeded. But success measured in survival of others while you died felt like a hollow victory. Evans picked up the sound-powered phone one last time and confirmed that all stations had been evacuated. Then he walked to the side of the bridge, climbed over the railing, and lowered himself toward the deck using a rope that someone had tied to a stanchion. His left hand, with its missing fingers, could not grip properly. He slipped, fell the last 10 feet, landed hard on the tilted deck, and felt something in his left leg break. Pain shot through him, white and blinding. He lay there for a moment, unable to move, wondering if he was going to die on the deck of his ship after all. Chief Jackson found him. The chief had been making a final sweep of the deck, checking for anyone left behind, and saw Evans lying near the base of the bridge superstructure. He ran over, assessed the situation in a glance, the broken leg, the bleeding shoulder, the gray pallor that indicated shock, and made a decision. He picked Evans up, ignoring the captain's protests, carried him across the tilted deck, and half lowered, half dropped him into a life raft that was already overloaded with wounded men. "Get him away from the ship," Jackson shouted to the sailors in the raft. "Paddle." Now, the raft began to move, pulled away from the Johnston by men using their hands as paddles because the actual paddles had been lost. Evans tried to sit up, tried to say something about going back for more men, but Jackson was already gone, heading back toward the ship to check for survivors. The raft drifted 50 yards away, then 100, then 200, and at 8:27 in the morning on October 25, 1944, the USS Johnston rolled to port, her deck vertical, and slid beneath the waves. She went down bow first, her stern rising high into the air, her propellers still visible, her flag still flying. Men in the life rafts and floater nets watched in silence as the ship disappeared, leaving only bubbles and debris and the smell of oil. Some of them saluted, some wept. Most were too exhausted to do anything but stare at the empty water where their ship had been. The Johnston was gone, but they were alive, floating in the Pacific, surrounded by debris and sharks and the distant sound of naval gunfire as the Japanese fleet retreated under air attack. They had no food, no water, limited medical supplies, and no idea when or if rescue would come. All they had was each other and the knowledge that they had fought a battle that should have killed them in the first 5 minutes, and they had survived for 90. The water off Samar was warm, over 80 degrees, which sounds pleasant until you realize that floating in 80-degree water for hours causes hypothermia almost as quickly as cold water, just more slowly and with more suffering along the way. The survivors of the Johnston, approximately 150 men out of a crew of 270, clung to life rafts, floater nets, and pieces of debris and waited. They waited through the rest of October 25th as the battle off Samar continued around them. Japanese ships retreating under continuous air attack, American ships searching for survivors but unable to stop and pick them up while the battle was still ongoing. They waited through the night, floating in darkness, listening to the sounds of men dying from wounds that had seemed survivable during daylight but became fatal when shock and blood loss accumulated over hours. They waited through October 26th as the sun rose and burned them, their skin blistering, their lips cracking, their tongues swelling from thirst. Some men drank seawater despite knowing it would kill them faster, because the thirst was unbearable and dying later seemed preferable to suffering now. They waited through another night, the second night, when more men died and their bodies had to be pushed away from the rafts because there was no way to carry them, and keeping corpses in the rafts was both practically and psychologically unbearable. Commander Evans spent those 2 days in and out of consciousness. His broken leg had been roughly splinted by Chief Jackson using pieces of wood scavenged from debris. His shoulder wound had been rebandaged by Corpsman Torres, who had stayed with the captain's raft despite being needed elsewhere because someone had to keep Evans alive. His missing fingers were infected, his head wound had reopened twice, and his heart condition, the arrhythmia he had hidden from the Navy for 6 months, was getting worse under the stress and dehydration. Torres did not think Evans would survive. He told Lieutenant Hagen this quietly during the first night, when Evans was unconscious and could not hear. Hagen, floating in the same raft with his broken collarbone and a dozen other wounds, looked at Evans's gray face and made a decision. If the captain dies, we do not tell the men until after we are rescued. They need to believe he is going to make it, because if they lose hope, more of them will die. Torres agreed, and for the next 2 days, whenever someone asked how the captain was doing, Torres lied and said he was stable. It was a necessary lie, the kind that saves lives by preserving morale, and Torres never regretted it even though he hated lying. Seaman Martinez spent the 2 days in a floater net with 6 other men, including Bobby Warren, the young loader, who had asked if they were going to make it. Warren had a broken arm and a concussion, and he kept asking the same questions over and over, evidence of head trauma that Torres would have treated if he had been in that net instead of with Evans. Martinez answered Warren's questions patiently, each time as if it were the first time, because that was what you did for crew. On the afternoon of October 26th, a shark appeared, a large one, circling the floater net and occasionally bumping against the ropes. The men in the net froze, knowing that thrashing would attract the shark and that they had no weapons, no way to defend themselves. The shark circled for 20 minutes, its dorsal fin cutting the water, its body occasionally visible as a dark shape beneath them. Then it lost interest and swam away. Martinez did not relax until the shark had been gone for an hour, and even then, he kept watching the water, knowing the shark could come back, knowing there were more sharks, knowing that every hour they spent in the water increased the chance of attack. Warren asked him if they were going to make it. Martinez said yes, and tried to believe it. Chief Jackson spent the 2 days moving between rafts and floater nets, checking on men, redistributing supplies, keeping people organized. He had no official authority anymore. The chain of command had dissolved when the ship sank, but Jackson was a chief petty officer and chiefs did not need official authority to lead. He led because someone had to, because without leadership the survivors would fragment into isolated groups focused only on their own survival, and fragmentation meant more death. Jackson kept count of the living and the dead, memorizing names because there was no way to write them down. He led prayers on the morning of October 26th, not because he was the most religious man in the group, but because ritual gave people something to focus on besides their suffering. He broke up to fights between delirious sailors who were hallucinating from dehydration and trying to attack each other. And when a young seaman, 18 years old, name of Thomas Ridley, decided he could not take it anymore and tried to swim away from the raft toward an imaginary ship on the horizon, Jackson grabbed him and held him until the delirium passed, even though Ridley fought and screamed and called him every name imaginable. Jackson did not let go, because letting go meant watching Ridley drown, and he had watched enough men die. On the morning of October 27th, 47 hours after the Johnston sank, rescue arrived. A destroyer escort, the USS Dennis, appeared on the horizon, moving slowly through the debris field, searching for survivors. The men in the rafts and floater nets began to wave, shouting, expending energy they did not have, desperate to be seen. The Dennis spotted them, altered course, and began the slow process of pulling men from the water. It took 3 hours to recover all the survivors. Some men had to be lifted by cargo nets because they were too weak to climb. Others were hauled aboard on stretchers. A few, the most badly wounded, were hoisted by lines tied under their arms, a procedure that was agonizing but necessary. Commander Evans was one of the last to be brought aboard, unconscious, barely breathing, his pulse thready and irregular. The ship's doctor took one look at him and immediately set up an intravenous line, pumping fluids and plasma, trying to stabilize a man who should have been dead already. Of the 273 men who had served on the Johnston, 186 were killed in action or died of wounds during the 2 days in the water. 87 survived. The survivors were transferred to a hospital ship, then to a base hospital in the Philippines, then gradually repatriated to the United States over the following months. Many of them carried wounds that would never fully heal, physical and psychological. All of them carried the memory of a battle that should have been a massacre, but became something else because a few captains decided to charge battleships with and because crews followed them. Commander Ernest Evans survived his wounds but never fully recovered. He spent for months in hospitals, undergoing surgeries to repair his shoulder, reset his leg, and treat the infections that had nearly killed him. His left hand, with its missing fingers, retained limited function. His heart condition worsened, as the doctors had predicted it would. In March of 1945, he was medically retired from the Navy with the rank of commander, awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions during the Battle off Samar, and sent home to Oklahoma. The citation for his Medal of Honor described his attack on the Japanese fleet as one of the most courageous actions in naval history, and used words like intrepid, valorous, and inspiring. Evans read the citation once and never looked at it again, because reading about courage while remembering the faces of the men who died under his command felt obscene. He moved to a small town outside Tulsa, found work as a teacher at a school for Cherokee children, and spent the next 7 years teaching history and mathematics to kids who reminded him why fighting had mattered. He never spoke about the war except once, during a class in 1950 when a student asked him what it felt like to be a hero. Evans looked at the kid for a long moment, then said quietly, "I am not a hero. The men who died on the Johnston were heroes. I am just someone who survived." The student, sensing that he had crossed a line, never asked again. Evans died on May 1, 1952, at the age of 43, from heart failure. He collapsed while teaching a class, was rushed to a hospital, and died 2 hours later. At his funeral, 7 men in Navy uniforms appeared, survivors of the Johnston, men who had traveled from across the country to be there. They stood in silence as Evans was buried with military honors, a Cherokee veteran who had proven that courage and leadership were not determined by race or background but by character. One of the survivors, Lieutenant Robert Hagen, spoke briefly at the graveside. He said that Evans had been the best captain he ever served under. Not because Evans was fearless, but because he was terrified and did his duty anyway, and that was the difference between a hero and a fool. Then Hagen saluted, and the other survivors saluted, and they walked away because there was nothing more to say. Evans's Medal of Honor was placed in a museum in Oklahoma, alongside a photograph of the Johnston and a plaque describing the battle off Samar. For decades, it gathered dust, visited by occasional history enthusiasts but largely forgotten by a nation that had moved on to new wars and new crises. The other survivors of the Johnston scattered across America, carrying the battle with them. Lieutenant Hagen returned to Minnesota, became a teacher like Evans, and spent 30 years explaining physics to high school students who had no idea their teacher had once charged battleships in a destroyer. He died in 1986, at the age of 75, surrounded by family. Chief Petty Officer Andrew Jackson returned to Mobile, worked as a mechanic, and became a deacon in his church, leading services and counseling veterans who struggled with their own demons. He survived 3 ship sinkings and lived to be 82, dying peacefully in his sleep in 1997, one of the last survivors of the Johnston. Seaman Joseph Martinez returned to Albuquerque, opened his garage as he had planned, and became successful enough to put all 6 of his siblings through college. He never spoke about the war to his family, but once a year, on October 25th, he closed the garage and spent the day alone, remembering. He died in 2007, at the age of 82. Bobby Warren, the young loader who kept asking if they were going to made it. He returned to Tennessee, married his high school sweetheart, had 4 children, and worked as a machinist for 40 years. He suffered from PTSD, though that term did not exist yet, and had nightmares about drowning for the rest of his life. But he lived, and his children lived, and his grandchildren lived, and none of them would have existed if the Johnston had not bought those 90 minutes on October 25, 1944. Medical Corpsman David Torres returned to Texas, used the G-bill to become a doctor, and spent 40 years practicing rural medicine in communities that could not afford fancy hospitals. He saved thousands of lives over his career, but he never forgot the men he could not save on the Johnston, the ones he had marked with a grease pencil and left behind because moving them would have killed others. He carried that guilt until he died in 2011, at the age of 89, despite the fact that every rational analysis said he had made the right decisions. Trauma does not care about rational analysis. Quartermaster Raymond Lee, who steered the ship with one hand after losing the other, underwent multiple surgeries to fit a prosthetic hand, learned to write left-handed, and became a librarian in California. He spent decades helping people find books, organizing information, creating order from chaos, perhaps because creating order was the opposite of what he had experienced in combat. He died in 1993, at the age of 70. None of these men considered themselves heroes. They considered themselves survivors, lucky to be alive when so many were not, and they carried that survivor's guilt like a weight that never lightened. They did not talk about the war much, did not attend reunions for decades, did not want to relive the worst moments of their lives. But they remembered. They always remembered. The USS Johnston was officially stricken from the Naval Register on November 3, 1944, 9 days after she sank. In the bureaucratic language of military record-keeping, she was listed as lost due to enemy action. Her wreck location recorded as approximately 11 degrees north latitude, 126 degrees east longitude, depth unknown. For the next 75 years, the Johnston lay on the bottom of the Philippine Sea, her hull slowly corroding, her guns silent, her crew's sacrifice remembered by a shrinking number of veterans and military historians but largely forgotten by the general public. The Battle off Samar, despite being one of the most extraordinary naval actions in history, was overshadowed by larger battles, bigger ships, more famous commanders. The Johnston and her sister ships became footnotes in history books, a paragraph or two in chapters about the Philippines campaign. Their story compressed into phrases like heroic destroyer charge and desperate defense that flattened the complexity and terror and humanity of what actually happened. But some people refused to let the story die. In 1969, a naval historian named James Hornfisher began researching destroyer actions in the Pacific and came across the action reports from October 25, 1944. He was struck by the sheer audacity of the attack, destroyers charging battleships, and began interviewing survivors. The survivors were reluctant to talk at first, but Hornfisher was patient and persistent, and gradually they opened up. The interviews revealed details that had never made it into official reports: Commander Evans's heart condition, Chief Jackson's improvised engineering, the moment when Ensign Billy was killed, the 2 days floating in shark-infested waters. Hornfisher compiled these interviews into an article that was published in the United States Naval Institute Proceedings in 1972, titled The Last Stand of the Tincan Sailors. The article attracted attention from other historians, from Navy personnel, from families of the crew, who had never known the details of how their fathers or grandfathers had died. It sparked a slow revival of interest in the battle off Samar and the ships that fought there. In 1983, a group of survivors organized the first official reunion of Johnston crew members. 23 men attended, out of the 87 who had survived the sinking. They gathered in San Diego, toured a modern destroyer, and spent 3 days telling stories, comparing memories, filling in gaps in each other's recollection. It was cathartic and painful in equal measure, reopening wounds that had scabbed over but never fully healed. One survivor, a man who had not spoken about the battle to anyone, including his wife for 38 years, broke down crying during a dinner and had to be helped from the room. But afterward, he said it was the first time since 1944 that he felt like someone and that alone made the pain worthwhile. The reunions continued annually, the attendance slowly declining as age and death thinned the ranks. The last reunion was held in 2015, attended by 3 survivors, the youngest of them 91 years. They posed for photographs, shook hands with Navy officers who thanked them for their service, and went home knowing it would be the last time they gathered as crew. In 2019, a deep-sea exploration team led by Victor Vesovo located the wreck of the USS Johnston at a depth of 6,156 meters, making her the deepest shipwreck ever discovered. The team used a submersible equipped with cameras and sonar to survey the wreck, capturing images of the hull, the gun mounts, the bridge where Commander Evans had stood, all of it preserved in the cold, dark water of the Philippine Trench. The photographs were haunting, the ship's bow section still largely intact, her guns still pointed forward as if ready to fire, her hull number 557 still visible on the bow. The discovery made international news, sparked renewed interest in the battle off Samar, and brought the story of the Johnston to a generation that had no living memory of World War II. Documentaries were made, books were written, museum exhibits were created. The Navy designated the wreck site as a war grave, protected from salvage and disturbance, a memorial to the 186 men who went down with the ship. In 2021, one of the last 3 surviving crew members, a man named Robert Billy Jr., named after the ensign who died on the bridge, watched footage of the wreck and wept, saying that he had wondered for 76 years what the ship looked like down there, and now he knew. And it was both beautiful and terrible. The Battle off Samar, fought on October 25, 1944, lasted approximately 2.5 hours and involved forces so mismatched that the outcome should have been a foregone conclusion. A Japanese fleet including 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers attacked an American force consisting of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escort. The Japanese had overwhelming advantages in firepower, armor, speed, and numbers. They should have annihilated Taffy 3 in 30 minutes, sunk the carriers, and proceeded to destroy the invasion fleet in Leyte Gulf, potentially turning the entire Philippines campaign into a disaster. Instead, the Japanese inflicted moderate damage, sank 1 escort carrier, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort, and then retreated after 2 hours of combat, convinced they were facing a much larger force. The Americans lost over 1,000 men, including the crews of the sunken ships, but saved the invasion fleet and maintained control of Leyte Gulf. The disparity between what should have happened and what actually happened is explained by 3 factors. Aggressive attacks by destroyers that disrupted Japanese formation, constant airstrikes from escort carrier aircraft that damaged Japanese ships and forced evasive, and catastrophic failures of Japanese command and communication that led Vice Admiral Kurita to make decisions based on false assumptions. But the deeper explanation is psychological. The Japanese commanders were exhausted, had been under continuous air attack for days, and when faced with suicidal destroy charges, they assumed they had blundered into a trap rather than recognizing it as an act of desperation. The American commanders and crews, faced with certain death if they did nothing, chose to attack because attacking at least gave them a sense of agency, a feeling that they were doing something rather than passively waiting to be killed. This decision, made independently by multiple destroyer captains including Ernest Evans, Robert Copeland, and William Thomas, was not heroic in the sense of being fearless. It was heroic in the sense of being terrified and acting anyway, of choosing to do something that mattered even if it cost everything. The Johnston's attack did not sink any battleships. Her torpedoes damaged 1 cruiser, her guns damaged another, and her presence forced multiple Japanese ships to take evasive action that broke their formations and wasted time. In isolation, those achievements seem minor, but in the context of a battle where minutes mattered, where every delay gave aircraft more time to attack and carriers more time to escape, those 90 minutes that the Johnston and her sister ships bought were the difference between disaster and survival. Historians have compared the battle off Samar to other historical last stands, Thermopylae, the Alamo, Rorke's Drift, battles where small forces held against overwhelming odds and bought time for larger strategic objectives. The comparisons are apt but also incomplete, because those historical battles were defensive actions where the smaller force held a position and waited for the enemy to attack. The battle off Samar was offensive. The destroyers did not wait for the Japanese to close and fight on defensive. They charged. They attacked ships 10 times their size with weapons that could barely scratch heavy armor. They did it knowing they would probably die. And they did it anyway because the mission required it and because their sense of duty outweighed their instinct for self-preservation. That kind of aggression, that willingness to attack when every tactical manual says you should defend or retreat, is rare in military history. It requires a combination of leadership, training, and moral courage that cannot be manufactured or faked. Commander Evans and the captains of the other destroyers possessed that combination, and their crews trusted them enough to follow. And together they accomplished something that should have been impossible. The battle off Samar also revealed uncomfortable truths about military planning and risk. Admiral Halsey's decision to leave San Bernardino Strait unguarded was a calculated gamble that almost ended in catastrophe. If the destroyers had not attacked, if Vice Admiral Kurita had pressed his advantage instead of retreating, if the escort carrier aircraft had been less effective, the outcome could have been drastically different. Halsey was criticized after the battle, defended himself by arguing that destroying the Japanese carriers was more important than defensive guard duty, and spent the rest of his life debating whether he had made the right decision. The debate continues among historians to this day. But what is not debatable is that the men of Taffy 3 paid the price for decisions made by commanders who were not present during the battle, and they paid it without hesitation or complaint because that is what military service. They were given an impossible mission, they executed it to the best of their ability, and nearly 2,000 of them died doing so. Their sacrifice deserves to be remembered not as an abstract strategic maneuver, but as a human cost. Faces and names and families, men who had lives and dreams and futures that ended in the dark water off Samar. The story of the USS Johnston and the battle off Samar matters not because it is inspiring, though it is, and not because it is dramatic, though it certainly is that as well. It matters because it reminds us that history is made by ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances. People who are scared and flawed and uncertain, but who choose to act anyway because not acting. Commander Ernest Evans was not a perfect man. He was stubborn, sometimes reckless, he pushed his crew too hard, and he concealed a medical condition that should have disqualified him from command. But when the moment came, when the Japanese fleet appeared and he had to choose between running and fighting, he chose to fight knowing it would probably kill him, because fighting was what the mission required and because his sense of duty was stronger than his fear. That choice saved thousands of lives. It also killed him, slowly, over the 7 years between the battle and his death. His heart failing, his body breaking down, his mind carrying the weight of the men he lost. Was it worth it? That is a question with no good answer, because how do you measure the value of one life against thousands? How do you quantify sacrifice? How do you balance survival against trauma? Evans never publicly answered that question. He taught school, lived quietly, and died young, and perhaps that is answer enough. The crew of the Johnston were not heroes in the sense that they were somehow different from other people. They were farm kids and city boys, mechanics and clerks, high school graduates and college dropouts, men who joined the Navy for a dozen different reasons and found themselves in a battle they never expected to fight. Most of them were terrified, many of them died. The ones who survived carried wounds, physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives, but they did their jobs. They manned their stations, fired their guns, fought their fires, helped their wounded, and when the ship went down, they helped each other survive. That is not exceptional courage. That is ordinary people being loyal to each other in the worst possible circumstances, and that kind of loyalty is more valuable and more rare than any tactical brilliance or strategic planning. The Johnston sank because she was hit by overwhelming firepower while fighting a battle she could not win. But her crew survived, at least some of them, because they refused to abandon each other. That matters. That is worth remembering. The lesson of the Johnston is not that war is glorious or that sacrifice is always rewarded. The lesson is that when ordinary people are asked to do extraordinary things, some of them rise to the challenge, and their actions ripple forward through time in ways they never see. The Johnston bought 90 minutes. Those 90 minutes allowed escort carrier aircraft to launch more strikes, which damaged Japanese ships, which delayed their advance, which allowed more American ships to escape, which meant more supplies reached the Marines on the beaches, which meant the invasion succeeded, which meant the Philippines were liberated, which meant the supply line to Japan's southern territories was cut, which shortened the war. None of the men on the Johnston saw that chain of causation. They saw only the immediate moment, battleships approaching, carriers fleeing, a decision to attack. But the decision mattered, and the consequences echoed through history, and that is why we remember. Not because the Johnston was a famous ship or because her crew were famous men, but because they did something that mattered when it mattered most. In 2025, 81 years after the battle, there are no living survivors of the USS Johnston. The last crew member died in 2023, at the age of 98, taking with him the final first-hand memories of what it felt like to stand on that deck, to hear those guns, to watch that ship sink. What remains are photographs, documents, action reports, interviews recorded decades ago, and a wreck lying 6,000 meters down in the Philippine Sea, silent and dark, a monument to courage that no one visits because the depth is too great and the pressure too extreme. What remains are stories, passed from historians to readers, from teachers to students, from one generation to the next, growing less detailed with each retelling but never quite disappearing because some stories are too important to let die. The Johnston was a destroyer, 2,700 tons of steel and machinery, built in a shipyard, commissioned in 1943, sunk in 1944. But she was also a crew, 273 men who lived and fought and in many cases died together, who trusted each other when trust was the only thing they had, who faced impossible odds and fought anyway because that was their job and because they believed it mattered. They were right, it mattered then, it matters now. And as long as someone tells their story, they will not be forgotten. If this story moved you, help keep these forgotten World War II skies alive by liking this video, sharing it with a friend who loves history, and subscribing so you don't miss the next untold mission.